Welcome to Stagecoach, where you'll find the best Western books on the market and the men and women who write them. This podcast is brought to you by Dusty Saddles Publishing, home of the best-selling authors in the Western genre. This is your host, Ginger Winters. Join us as we continue the story of Jubal Stone, U.S. Marshal, Eye for an Eye, by Casey Nash.
Chapter 7. Ketchum dropped off Jubal at the Singer. There, he got a good night's sleep and woke up with an appetite. After polishing off a stack of flapjacks and a side of bacon at the nearest diner, he limped down to the livery and set up with Wilkes. Then he and Red walked to the depot where he bought their passage. A day and a half later, Marshal Stone arrived in Waco. He unloaded Red from the livery car and led him up Main Street to the jail hitch. Deputy Miller greeted him on the stoop with a strong cup of coffee.
"Welcome home, Marshal Stone. I best get word to the judge that you're back. He's been wearing out a path from here to his office looking for you."
"Howdy, FM." He tied off the roan and slowly climbed the steps with the help of the handrail. That's when FM realized something was wrong. She looked down and saw a small bloodstain that had bled through his bandage through his knee.
"What in Sam Hill happened to you, Jubal?"
She set the cups down on the nearby bench and rushed down the steps to give him a hand.
"You've been tangling with a wildcat?"
"Yep, a feller the name of Gus Giles, but I'm alright, FM. A few slugs of your coffee will perk me up."
"I'll run fetch the doc."
He waved his hand in protest. "No, not just yet."
"But you're bleeding."
She pointed down at his pants. "Stop mothering me, Miller. Reckon you better fetch the judge." FM's mouth was flung open.
"Gus Giles. Why, he's killed—"
"Fetch the judge, deputy."
"Yes, sir,"
Miller said as she walked away from him sideways, looking a bit stunned in his demeanor. He had never been this gruff with her. As she trotted up the boardwalk, she thought about her exchange with Jubal and quickly resolved to pass it off.
"Shoo, reckon if I'd been shot in the knee, I'd be on the prod. And to boot, being forced back to Waco while the man that killed my family is still roaming free. I don't blame Jubal for being edgy."
Miller reached Brewster's office and walked in with a quick tap on his door.
"Judge Brewster."
"Come in, FM," he said, tilting his head back down as he looked over his spectacles. "Then Marshal mine back yet?" he asked gruffly as he pulled a cigar from the corner of his mouth.
"Yes, sir, but—"
"But what?" he said with curiosity mixed with frustration as he reached for his hat and stepped toward the door like a man in a hurry. FM blocked the doorway with her body.
"Wait, Uncle Leon." She put her hand to his chest. "Jubal came riding in with a bullet wound to the knee. He and Gus Giles locked horns. Ain't sure what Giles' current condition is, but if I had to guess, he's having trouble looking over the dirt covering his eyes."
Brewster took a step back and relaxed his stance. With a wide grin, he shook his head. "That marshal we've got is a dandy, isn't he, FM? Why, he'd fight the devil himself if need be. He reminds me of his pa, Joe Stone." Brewster looked up to the ceiling. "I might have to give him a raise."
"How about one of them for me too, Uncle Leon?"
"We'll see, Deputy Miller." He chuckled as he put his fingers in his vest. "We'll see. Let's go say howdy to Jubal. I've got to pass a little work for him." Miller frowned.
"Now, Judge—"
"All right." He raised his hand, the one holding a cigar. "Reckon it can wait a couple more days. Give that knee a little time to heal."
"Figure Jubal's a quick healer, do you, Judge?"
Miller's words put Brewster on the prod. "FM, I'm having trouble remembering whether I'm wearing my uncle hat or judge hat the longer I talk to you." He pursed his lips. "Let's go see about Jubal." As the two of them walked down the boardwalk, Leon recollected what Miller had told them. "Gus Giles," he said out loud. "The law's been after him for over 5 years. He's beat the devil around the stump more times than a feller has a right to."
"I figure Jubal's done him a change of address, Uncle Leon."
"You got a lot of faith in him, don't you, FM?" He stared down at her with a grin.
"Yes, sir, I reckon I do. He don't have a lick of quit in him. Sure wish he could have stayed after Fletcher."
"Now hold up there, FM. You've got your bull in my pasture." They both stopped walking. They were now just outside the jail. Miller smiled sheepishly at the judge, then looked down at the steps. "What's wrong, FM?" She pointed.
"Blood on the steps."
Well, you act surprised. Didn't you tell me that Jubal was wounded? Before she could answer, Jubal pulled open the door. You two have a permit for loitering? Marshal Stone, Brewster said with an excited voice and extended hand. Good to see you back in Waco. Heard you and Gus Giles tied up. Jubal shook his hand. Yes, sir, we did. Just outside of Fort Worth. Sheriff Rigby and his boys had him backed in the draw. Well, don't keep us in suspense, son. Is he still with us? No, sir, Jubal answered as he limped down the step toward Red. I done him in, but gave me a slug through the knee before he bit the dirt. Well, now, that's some good news. Some very good news for sure. Ain't that right, Deputy? It sure is, Judge, said Miller. That man a long worn out his welcome on the frontier. Jubal put his hand to the cantle, then reached for his bandana in his back pocket. Wiping the dust from his saddle, he rolled the cloth into a wad. I heard of a fellow, a Confederate colonel named McCullough, who used the blood of those he killed to oil his saddle. FM stared over to Brewster and shrugged her shoulders. The judge returned the gesture as he stuck a cigar back in his mouth and looked down at Jubal. Colonel who? What'd you say he did with blood? McCullough. Oiled the saddle with that man's blood. Miller, again, stared at the judge, trying to make sense of Jubal's ramblings. Suddenly, she raised her palms in the air towards Brewster, then said, I'm going to make us a fresh pot of coffee. As she moved toward the door, Brewster said, That's a good idea. When the door closed, Leon looked back to Stone and pulled the cigar from his mouth. Let's step in here and bend an elbow, Jubal. I brought a pint of rye here in my coat. The marshal stood silent for a few moments, then flipped the fender over the top of his saddle and unhitched the girth and the backstrap. With force, he yanked the saddle to the ground, then reached to untie Red. Reckon I'll have to pass on that, Judge. Going to fetch Red to delivery. Nonsense, Jubal. You need to rest that leg. Have you seen the doc? Before Stone could answer, Brewster looked up the boardwalk and saw a young fellow by the name of Randall. He waved him forward. Son, take the marshal's horse down to delivery, then fetch the doctor. Leon tossed him a coin. Thank you, Judge Brewster. Randall took the reins from Jubal and led him away. Jubal watched the roan following the boy. That's a good horse going yonder. Given me by Sheriff Monty Peel of Palestine. Jubal, you all right? Something seems off plumb, remarked the judge as he flicked the remainder of his stogie off the stoop and into the dirt. Stone turned on his heels, which caused some discomfort. Why didn't you let me stay after Fletcher? I could have had him in hand by now. Jubal's bottom lip quivered and his fist balled up. Down deep inside, he'd been angry since he received Brewster's telegram ordering it back to Waco pronto. Jubal had promised the dead ranger in Omaha he'd kill the man that had done him in. He also vowed to Tink he'd pay Fletcher back an eye for an eye, not to mention the promise he'd made to his own family. Now, the man who hindered him from doing so was standing just a few feet from him. You should have let me stay on his trail, Judge. Figure it was the right thing to do so, do you, Jubal? Yes, sir, I do, Stone responded loudly. Pounding his chest, he continued. That man killed my pa, my ma, and my little sister. I made promises to those he harmed and killed. You call me off a hot trail, Judge. Reckon if you lost kin to that varmint, you'd feel different. Stone turned and looked across the street, seething with anger. FM stepped out on the stoop with a horrified expression on her face. She couldn't believe Jubal was letting into the judge, not Judge Leon Brewster. He usually wouldn't tolerate such from any man, especially one of his employees. Staring at Stone, she hoped to dissuade him from further confrontation, especially in public. You fellas ready for some coffee? It's hot and ready to be drunk. Neither Brewster nor Jubal responded. They just stared at one another, like two range bulls sizing up one another. Finally, the judge turned to Miller. Deputy, I'm going back to my office. When the marshal here comes back down to earth and gets a hold of himself, send for me. FM nodded nervously and waved back and forth for Jubal to come into the office. Brewster pulled down on his derby hat and left, cussing under his breath as he walked briskly up the boardwalk. Dang tin horn, Marshal. Coming apart at the laces he is, I don't put up with insubordination from nobody. The closer Leon got to his office, however, he began to soften toward Stone. Reckon that young man's been through a lot these last few weeks, and from the wires I've been getting from Omaha and across Texas, Jubal Stone has thinned out some of the worst, not to mention Gus Giles. I'm proud of that youngster. Figure after I had a snort and simmer down, I'll come back and have a chat with him. Chapter 8. As Jubal limped through the door, carrying his saddle, he quickly let FM know he wasn't in for a lecture. Deputy Miller, before you commence giving me a sermon on proper judge etiquette, don't. I ain't no mood to talk about what just happened neither. Miller stared angrily across the room at Jubal.
Marshal, I figure I'm risking my job and maybe my health if you're so inclined to hit a woman, but I'm bound and determined to give you some information about Judge Brewster you need to know.
Stone was still steaming from his interaction with Brewster, and his anger quickly transferred to Miller. Wouldn't be the first woman I laid hands on. He was recollecting the brunette and her female partner who tried to kill him and Sheriff Kincaid on the train. However, just as soon as the memory crossed his mind, it bothered him that he was forced to hit a woman. Hope I never have to do that again. Pa taught me better. Jubal took a deep breath and sat down at his desk with a haggard look on his face. Reaching in the bottom drawer, he pulled out a bottle of rye, something he seldom did, and 2 glasses. Let's have a shot of what makes the mouse chase the cat up the tree. Then you can tell me what's on your mind, FM, before you bust. Miller sighed.
Sounds good to me. I haven't been this emotional since I got married.
Married? Jubal stopped pouring the rye and looked up at FM.
Yeah, but then I woke up.
Dang you, Miller, you had me going there. He chuckled.
Oh, you don't think I could get married?
FM put her hands to her hips. Now hold up there, deputy. Don't be putting words in my mouth. Miller stared down at Jubal, then exploded with laughter.
Haven't got no need of a man in my life.
She patted the iron on her hip.
Reckon this here is all I need.
Jubal smiled, which brought even more needed relief to the tension in the room. Now, FM, reckon I'm ready to hear my lecture. I've already ripped my britches with the judge. Speaking of getting fired, I might be looking for work soon myself. Miller pointed at Jubal.
So I ain't gonna lose my job or get hit if I tell you how the cow ate the cabbage?
No, neither. You got your flint set, now pull the trigger. I'm listening. Just aim a little higher than my knee, would you?
Jubal, I'm plumb sorry about your family being gunned down. And I figured one of the hardest things you ever did besides bury them and live through it was coming back to Waco without Fletcher draped over his saddle.
Stone threw the shot glass to his mouth and slowly set the empty glass on the desk, rubbing the rim in a circular motion with his finger. All true, Miller. All true. Now what's your point? Jubal asked as he lifted his wounded leg atop the chair next to him, with a hand to his pants. FM threw back her glass and emptied it as well. With tears in her eyes, she said,
I'll have another.
Jubal quickly poured 2 fingers and smiled. Take it easy on this stuff, deputy, or I might have to arrest you for public drunkenness. Again, she downed the liquor quickly, but this time set her glass down beside Jubal's.
What I've got to tell you brings back a lot of memories.
Well, then don't, said Jubal, pushing around his empty glass with his finger. Tears were now streaming down FM's face, something Jubal had not seen before. She turned away and wiped them, then turned back to Stone, determined to tell her story.
About 15 years ago, me and my family joined a wagon train headed to Oregon. There were 22 of us in all. We nooned along the creek.
FM looked across the room and her face lit up with a smile.
I could still see the sugar-white sand along the banks and almost hear the water rushing over those rocks. I figured there were fish to be caught and begged my ma to let me take a willow pole and try my luck. I wasn't the only one who was of that mind. The 4 of us, a man, his 2 daughters, and me went downstream about half a mile and found some still water. Jade green it was, greenest water I'd ever seen. We each laid our willow poles on the ground and went hunting worms and crickets, or anything we thought would lure catfish.
She shook her head and chuckled, reliving her childhood experience. Enthralled in FM's story, her silence begged Jubal's question. Did y'all catch anything? With a wide grin, she'd answered,
We sure did, and I caught the biggest one.
Jubal patted the table with his hand. What'd your ma say about that? Miller lowered her head and stepped away from the desk. Turning on her boot heels, she spoke through her anger and tears.
Ma never saw my catch. Just as we were fetching our fish and getting ready to come back to camp, we heard a gunfire, and lots of it. Then we saw smoke rising in the distance, exactly where our wagon train was.
Miller's face twisted as if she was in pain. She grabbed her stomach and bent over. Jubal rose up and started her way, but she quickly recovered and waved him off. Breathing in and out, she straightened and regained her composure. Now, where was I? FM, you don't have to finish this story if you don't want to. Figure I know what happened. No, you don't, Jubal. Not the whole story. When we got to the camp, all the wagons were on fire and there were bloody bodies lying everywhere. I wanted to run to where I remembered our wagon was and find my mom and pa, but the man who took us fishing wouldn't let me. In fact, he gathered me and his 2 daughters around his waist and we all cried together. Miller looked up almost as if in a trance. I remember his big, gentle hand stroking my long brown hair and promising me we would be all right. Then he took us into some brush and demanded we stay put. Miller wagged her head and stared at Jubal as if looking through him. How long did he leave you girls there? Did he go for help? No. He dug graves for the next 6 hours. Buried my mom and pa first, his wife and baby boy next, then the rest of them. I'll never forget his big bloody hands from all the bodies, and also from the rips in his skin with 6 hours of digging and covering done. Stone wiped his eyes and stared at the bottle of rye on his desk. I don't know what to say, FM, except that I'm sorry. I had no idea of your loss. Whatever happened to the man who buried your parents? Miller sniffed and wiped her nose with her sleeve. Then, with a crooked grin, she answered the marshal's question. He became a judge, Jubal Stone. One of the best Texas has ever had. Judge Brewster? He asked incredulously. Yes, sir. Judge Leon Brewster. And you want to know what he told those rangers that rode up after the wagon train massacre? Reckon I do. When they asked if they wanted to let him ride after the men who did the dirty deed, he said no. He wanted them to take his daughters and me to safety. Jubal poured himself another shot of rye. To Jubal Stone, the biggest idiot who ever lived in Waco. He told the judge if he had kin killed by Fletcher, he'd feel different. I really stepped in it this time. You didn't know, Jubal, but now you do. She walked over to pick up the bottle of booze and filled her glass. To Judge Leon Brewster? You bet, FM. To Judge Leon Brewster. He pushed his glass gently towards hers and they bumped together, glass to glass. Then they put them to their lips. A couple more, and the 2 law officers were both the giddy goats. An hour later, FM staggered toward the door. I'm going home, Marshal. You're a bad influence on me. I'll be back in the morning, if I'm able. Jubal waved even though she was already gone, and limped over to his bunk. His knee wasn't hurting nearly as much as it was when he first arrived in Waco a couple of hours previously. The alcohol had numbed his pain and his anger and caused him to doze off to sleep. But before the night was through, Stone would realize the downside of being stoned. Throughout the night, Miller's story about her and the judge continued to race through his mind. Then he began to dream. Oddly, he was transported back to Cherry Hill Cemetery outside of Abilene where he talked with his father. Well, he slipped through our hands, Pa, Jubal said with regret in his voice as he removed his hat and knelt at Joe Stone's headstone. Tobias Fletcher. He took Tink hostage and I had to let him go. Oh, Pa, you didn't know Tinker Johnson, did you? Quite a young man. Going to be a fine lawyer or judge one day and probably a whole lot more. I wasn't for sure when he left out in front of Fletcher that day in Omaha if I'd ever see him again. I still hate that I had to let Tobias go, but Tink was close to seeing the pearly gates when I caught up with him. Reckon I'm getting ahead of myself, Pa. Back to Fletcher. He thought he'd beat us around the stump by changing his name and location. Been using the handle Albert Dillingham. He and a couple of other big hogs at the trough had a lucrative cattle rustling ring across a large swathe of Texas. Guess Fletcher figured robbing banks didn't pay. You taught him that lesson, Pa. Jubal chuckled. A brigade of lawmen, under the commission of a hard-nosed federal judge by the name of Leon Brewster, busted up their illegal enterprise. You remember Brewster, don't you, Pa? I work for him now out of Waco. Matthew Kincaid, his deputies, and I left out of Sherwood in search of the rustlers across Texas. With the help Judge Tom Mason, Marshal Bigelow of Omaha, and a couple of his deputies along with 3 rangers, we tied a can to their tails. Jubal pursed his lips and stared across the graveyard. Dropping his head, he continued. We lost a good one in that gunfight in Omaha. Ranger Roy McLeod was his name. Fletcher and his gun slicks done him in. Jubal pointed to the ground. Lying there bleeding and gasping for breath, Roy asked me to play my flute. Fact is, he said the same thing old Frank wrote on that piece of paper and left in my pocket. Play, Jubal, play. So that's what I'd done. Pulled out my piccolo and played my best. It seems to suit Ranger McLeod because he looked my way and smiled. Then I figure he's up there with you now. Jubal chuckled and shook his head. That Matthew Kincaid is quite a fellow, Pa. Of course, I ain't telling you what you don't already know yourself. Matt said you taught him all he knew about being a wallman. Well, Pa, I can tell you from first-hand experience. You've done a right smart job of it. That man's saltier than a salt mine, and his game is a yearling buck. He's a little long in the horn, but still fast on the draw. I sure wouldn't want to get on his bad side. Jubal looked up into the sky, remembering the swell time he'd had at the Kincaids, then down to his ma's headstone. He's got a mighty fine family. Ma, Mrs. Mays, Pip, and them boys of theirs. Well, they're a fine lot, along with their wives. Hope one day I can find me a woman of their cut. Stone looked to his sister's grave. Come to think of it, Nancy reminds me of the Kincaid woman, Mary. She sure has grown up to be a beautiful woman. Fact is, she's the one that kept things looking so nice around here. Planted these pretty flowers and kept the weeds pulled. Looking forward to seeing that pretty gal directly. Hope she doesn't have no ring on her finger by now. I reckon I should have written to let her know I was coming. Ma, back to the Kincaids. I know I shouldn't have, but I felt a little jealous of their family and their ranch. Still can't wrap my head around why that was all took from me. Stone looked back to his pa's tombstone and sat down. Want to hear something that'll make your teeth show, Pa? First night I met Matt and I stayed out at his ranch, he called me Joe. That's right, Pa. He said I looked so much like you that by accident he called me by your name, twice. Several times I caught him staring at me, admiring our resemblance, I figured. Dang sure made me proud. What I would give to just be able to climb back in the saddle next to you and hunt them newborn calves in the sagebrush, or go rabbit hunting on the plains. I think a lot about that last antelope hunt we took. You made a dandy shot in that pronghorn at 300 yards. But Pa, I'd give anything if we could partner up and bring Tobias Fletcher together. The next morning, Jubal woke up in his bunk at the jail with a throbbing headache. Now he had two pains to deal with, including his knee. FM wobbled through the door, holding a hand to her forehead. Feels like I've been kicked in the head by your big roan, Jubal. How you faring? FM, I swear there were a couple of rattlesnakes at the bottom of that bottle we killed last night, and I got bit by both. I wonder my ma told me more than a few times to stay away from the spirits. Smart lady, yo ma. You decided to drink again. You'll do it without me, Marshal. I've been up chugging since 4 o'clock this morning. Besides, it doesn't look right for a woman of my stature to be given to spirits. Jubal chuckled. Dang if we ain't a pair of fools. Yep, we're Waco's law officers, cream of the crop we are. Miller slapped her knee, but quickly returned her hand to her forehead. Stone appreciated his deputy's humor, but suddenly his demeanor changed to very serious. FM, I'm sorry about what happened to your family and the judges. Appreciate you telling me about it last night. I know that was hard. Figured I've got a fence to mend with. Before Jubal could finish what he was saying, the door creaked open. It was Brewster. Looks like you two tied one on last night, he said gruffly. He stared in silence, watching the officers struggle for words. Then he grinned. And you didn't even invite me to join the party. Judge, about yesterday out there on the boardwalk, Jubal said apologetically from across the room. Brewster quickly changed the subject. Where can a feller get a hot cup of coffee around here? Leon pitched a small bag of arbuckles to Miller. Boil some of that, would you, FM? Miller mustered a smile through her hangover and stepped toward the coffee pot, filling it with water from the bucket on the floor and some of the ground arbuckles. Then she stoked the belly stove with a kindling piled next to the wall. Why don't you fellas welcome the morning out on a stoop? I'll bring you a cup when it's ready. Brewster nodded, as did Jubal. From the noise she was making with the tin pot and the iron stove, they were glad to do so. As they got seated, Stone attempted to apologize again. Judge Brewster, I'm... Marshal Stone, you see that big sunflower yellow thing rising there in the east? Leon pointed. Jubal nodded. It's a new day. So what do you say we call yesterday and move on, shall we? Jubal extended his hand. Yes, sir, that sounds mighty good to me. Brewster shook Jubal's hand firmly and looked to the sound of a man coming. Howdy, Ed, said Leon as the milkman walked by. Ed reciprocated.
Morning, Judge. He was carrying a milk can in each hand.
Looks like the makings of a fine day here in Waco, Marshal. A fine day.
Leon pulled out 2 cigars.
How about a smoke?
Normally, Jubal would have abstained, but he wasn't about to turn down the judge's generosity, especially in the light of what happened the previous evening. Well, I've done defiled my temple with spirits, as my ma would say, so why not? Jubal took the stogie from the judge and reached for a match in his vest pocket. Striking it against the post, he lit the judge's first, then his. As they puffed on their cigars, the smoke from both collected together in the gentle breeze and wafted off to their right. FM bumped the bottom of the door with her boot. A little help here, please. Jubal reached around from the bench and opened it. Here you go, gents, she said as she handed them each a cup of coffee. Now, if you want any more, you'll have to fetch it yourself. Judge, I've got some papers for you to sign before you light out. Jubal noticed Miller blinking her eyes, still trying to shake off her barrel fever. He was doing the same himself. Brewster put a hand to his hat as if saluting. Yes, ma'am. Then he puffed on his cigar, as did Jubal, and the two of them watched as the town of Waco woke up. A fine town we have here, Mr. Stone. A fine town. Yes, sir, it is. Suddenly, Jubal thought about how the judge had just addressed him. Mr. Stone, Jubal wondered. Is the judge relieving me of my job? Leon took a gulp of his coffee. Shoo-wee! Can't beat Arbuckles. Say, how did Matt and May react to that coffee I sent them? They were obliged, Judge, and were generous enough to share it with me. Jubal raised his cup to his mouth as he glanced Brewster's way, still wondering if he was a United States Marshal, or had Leon Brewster just retired him. Jubal. The judge looked down to the boardwalk. Stone braced for the worst. I've had a lot of lawmen work for me, and you're one of the best that's ever wore that badge. Figured I owe you an explanation for calling you off Fletcher. Stone was relieved by Brewster's words, but quickly pivoted to an apology, the one he'd been trying to make since the judge arrived this morning. No, sir, you don't. I should have. Jubal, son, let me finish. Leon shifted around on the bench and crossed his leg over his knee. I would imagine by now FM has told you our story. Her kin and mine getting massacred. Jubal nodded as the judge looked to him for confirmation. Some folks would wonder why I didn't go after the killers that day. Fact is, I couldn't raise them that died back to life, but I could care for those 3 little girls, entrusted to me by the good Lord, so that's what I did. Stone was relieved that he still had his job, but he had a burning question running through his brain. Judge, were the men ever brought to justice? Leon injected. Yes, sir, that's what I was wondering. I hung 'em 8 years later. Stone grinned and slapped his leg, the one that wasn't wounded. So they did pay. He must have felt some better after that. That's where you're wrong, Jubal. I watched 5 of 'em swing from the gallows, after which I felt as hollow as a dead log. I didn't understand why until I crossed paths with an old preacher. He reminded me of the story of Cain and Abel. You familiar with that one, Jubal? Yes, sir, I am. I figured you were. Well, after Cain killed his brother, Abel's blood cried out for vengeance, am I right? Yes, sir. My ma read the Bible to us. Bad thing Cain killing his brother like that. Leon nodded. That preacher I told you about, he came to me a week before the hangings, almost as if the Almighty above had sent him. Judge Brewster, he said, I got a word for you. Brewster tapped Jubal on the leg. Mind you, I've never been what you'd call a churchgoer, but I do believe we all have a maker. So I wondered to myself what kind of sermon was I about to get. Jubal thought about what he told FM last night, that he didn't want a lecture or a sermon. What'd the parson tell you, Judge? Stone's curiosity was at a full chisel. That vengeance belongs to God Almighty, and that when we take it upon ourselves to parcel it out, it will never bring us peace or contentment. Son, I've heard you quote that passage from the Bible, an eye for an eye, several times. But let me tell you what the man of the cloth went on to say. It's something that stuck with me all these years. Abel's blood cried out for vengeance, but the blood of Jesus spoke a better word, pardon. Jubal wagged his head and took another drag from the cigar. Blowing the smoke in the air, he turned to Brewster. But you did hang him.
Yep, but first I made sure they had proper representation, and I sent Parson Gibbs to their cells so them that wanted to could make amends with God. For the next few moments, both men sat in silence as the sun was now rising over the trees. I'll give you what you said some thought, Judge, but I ain't making no promises when it comes to Fletcher. If he were in my sights today, I would have no problem pulling the trigger. Fair enough, Jubal, fair enough. Reckon I'll step in here and sign those papers. Don't want FM on my bad side, especially with her feeling so poorly today. Brewster stood and put his hand on Jubal's shoulder. You're a good man, Jubal Stone. Joe and your ma would be proud. As Brewster stepped through the door, Jubal looked back at him. Obliged for your words, Judge. Could I ask you a question? Brewster nodded. What made you want to be a judge? Those men that raided their wagon train is where it started for me, I suppose. His answer satisfied Jubal, and Leon went on inside. Chapter 9. Over the next 2 weeks, Jubal's knee healed up quickly, and he was able to begin serving those warrants Brewster had signed and was anxious to get served. To expedite matters, Jubal recommended that his office add 2 additional deputy marshals to the staff to expedite the backlog of court cases. The judge agreed with Jubal and approved his request. Jubal only hoped he could get the same cut of men and women to wear the badge as Matt Kincaid's deputies. He hired 2, Tanner Burns and Jericho Tatum. Jubal spent a lot of time with both men, preparing them for their jobs. FM even helped with their shooting lessons since she was a dead shot with her pistol. Things in Waco seemed to be going as smooth as glass. Then one afternoon, Judge Brewster walked through the door bearing a stern look and holding 2 pieces of paper. 2 extradition papers. That fellow you arrested 2 nights ago, Ed Wheeler, is wanted for stealing a horse in Mansfield. I ain't surprised. He didn't exactly want to go into that cell, but Tanner and Jericho persuaded him that it was safer in there than in the hallway, said a smiling Jubal. Need him delivered to Sheriff John Tyler there in Mansfield. Before Jubal took the paper, he grinned and said, Maybe a good job for our new deputies. They need to get their feet wet. FM sensed the judge was on edge. She stepped over to read the second paper in his hand. Brewster turned it her way. Her eyes widened as she put a hand to her mouth. Tobias Fletcher to be put in Marshal Jubal Stone's custody and brought to Waco upon my orders, Judge Leon Brewster. Jubal read her reaction. Why, FM, you look like as if the devil himself was on that paper. It was his highbinder that's got you blushing. Miller looked to the judge and he returned her stare. Then they both looked at Jubal as Brewster leaned toward him with the paper. Figure you better bring this one in personally, Marshal. Stone's heart skipped a beat as he took the paper in hand. He now knew who the warrant was for, Tobias Fletcher. But, Judge, he said curiously, I didn't think you wanted me to... Brewster stepped toward Jubal. Son, you weren't ready to go after Fletcher a few weeks ago, but now I think you are. He tapped him on the shoulder. Jubal rubbed the scar on his forehead, then stuck the warrant in his shirt pocket. Turning on his heels, he said, I'll leave at first light. Take them pup deputies with you. I believe you're right. They need to get their feet wet. How's your leg? You all healed up? Jubal was stuck in deep thought as he looked across the room. Brewster glanced at Miller and gestured for her to offer Stone a cup of coffee. Marshal, how about a cup of coffee? No thanks, FM, but I'd be obliged if you 2 would join me for a finger of rye. Judge, you game? Brewster brushed down the front of his clothes and put his hands to his lapel. By all means. They followed Jubal to his desk. He pulled out 3 glasses and a new bottle of rye. To justice, Jubal said. It's been a long time coming. Hear, hear, said the deputy and judge, and the 3 of them emptied their glasses. Whereabouts did they catch Fletcher, Judge? Asked Miller. West of Denver, a little town called Beaver Creek. Got him in Amarillo. The 2 lawmen had already lost their lives bringing him in. What happened? Asked Miller with a frown. Did they get careless with Fletcher or forgot how dangerous he was? Torn Tobias. It was bounty hunters, Jubal said angrily as he slammed his fist down on the desk. I told that madam what's-her-name for extra money she and her partner put on Fletcher's head was going to get good people killed. 2 lawmen. With a concerned look, the judge stared at Stone. Jubal, you and your deputies are liable to have to fight your way from Amarillo to the way back to Waco. I'm sending a passable wires out today for assistance. He chuckled. Don't reckon you figured on having to protect Tobias Fletcher, did you? Judge, he pulled at his shirt, I'll do what this badge demands of me. Nothing less. Miller's head rocked backwards. She couldn't believe these words came out of Jubal's mouth.
Just 2 weeks ago, he was ready to take a swing at the judge for not letting him be the one to kill Fletcher. Now he's vowing to protect the killer with his life. I don't figure.
Jubal caught her stare. Deputy Miller, you ever heard the story of Cain and Abel? Before she could answer, he continued, Get the judge to tell you about it one day. He glanced over at Leon. I'll leave first light. He walked toward the door. Going to have Curly shoe red. FM, fetch Tanner and Jericho pronto. Tell them to get some supplies together. We're going to escort a polecat back to Waco.
Yes, sir. Anything else?
Yep, he said as he pulled open the door. Have Ed Wheeler ready to travel at daybreak. We'll drop him off, then hightail it to Amarillo. You're in charge while we're gone, Miller. Looking in them files earlier, there's still a couple of more warrants that need serving. Think you can handle that? Miller patted her side.
Me and my man will take care of it.
Just serve the warrants, Miller. Don't shoot them. The three of them chuckled. Judge, anything else I need to know before me and my deputies light out? Nah, not that I know of. Like before, I'll get some money together for you and the legal documents you'll need to transport the prisoners. He stood and pointed to Jubal. You take care of yourself and them young bucks you call deputies and bring Tobias back alive, if possible. When the rooster crowed the next morning, Marshal Stone, his prisoner, and his deputy marshals, along with their horses, were aboard the train northbound to Hillsboro, making a short stop at Cleburne. Then they were on to Mansfield, where they delivered their prisoner before striking for Amarillo via Fort Worth. As Marshal Stone sat in his seat staring out of the small window, he thought of the last time he'd been on the train in disguise. He and Sheriff Kincaid didn't want to give away their identities, especially with the bounty on both of their heads. So he dressed as a hobo and Kincaid played the part of a mute. Today, however, was different. Jubal looked down at his badge and proudly rubbed any dust that might have collected on it. Then he looked over at Tanner, who was in the seat across from him, handcuffed to the prisoner. His deputy badge was half hidden under his coat. Leaning over, Stone whispered, Deputy Burns, pin that star where everybody knows you're the law. Yes, sir. Tanner quickly moved it to the center of his shirt. Jericho, sitting directly behind them, looked down at his to make sure it was in plain view. Jubal kept his eye on Ed Wheeler. A horse thief in Texas usually got hanged, and a man facing a rope can be deadly. He'd already warned his deputies not to let down their guard, not for a second. Of course, Jubal's greater concern was getting Fletcher back to Waco without a lot of people dying in the process. Maybe I'll just save myself and my deputies a lot of trouble and hang Tobias from the first cottonwood we get to. Or I just let him make a run for it and shoot him down like he did my family. He gives me a lick of trouble, I'll not hesitate to pump his carcass full of lead. Turning his head to the side, he spoke to Jericho, who leaned forward so as to not miss the marshal's words. Jericho, don't be afraid to pull iron and push lead. There's a $100,000 reward on the man we'll be bringing back with us. Been told the love of money is the root of all evil. Already been 2 officers killed in the line of duty fetching back Tobias. I don't plan for any of the 3 of us to make the obituaries, anytime soon anyway. Jericho shifted around in his seat. You know this feller Fletcher, do you, Marshal? I do. He's caused a world of pain to many, including myself. I'd like to put a bullet in his brain pan, but this badge won't allow it. Again, the words, an eye for an eye, shot across his mind. But this time, they were met with some resistance from his conscience. The judge's words have made their mark. The blood of Jesus speaks a better word. Pardon. Tanner, a young, lanky, affable fellow, got a Charlie horse in his leg and quickly stood up to stretch. Overhearing Stone's words to Jericho, he sat back down and asked, What'd he do to you, Marshal, if you don't mind me asking? I do, Tanner, Jubal said as he looked out the train window, watching the landscape zip by. But before we get back to Waco, I'll tell you. Fair enough? Burns nodded as he stood back up with another cramp. Then something caught the deputy's eye. He tipped his hat and smiled, still chained to Wheeler. Jubal and Jericho looked over their shoulders and saw a pretty young lady sitting by what looked to be her mother. Pay attention to your business at hand, Deputy Burns. Yes, sir, Marshal. He quickly sat down and checked the cuffs on his prisoner. You got me a story I want to tell you, fellers. Jubal slumped down in his seat a few inches and got comfortable. Tanner, this one ought to be especially of interest to you. Jericho kicked Tanner's seat and with his eyes reprimanded him for his overtures toward the female passenger, especially with a horse thief sitting next to him, a man destined for a rope. "I'm listening, Marshal," Tanner said as he cast Jericho a stern look. "Just got a little distracted is all." For the next few minutes, Jubal told the young lawman the experience he and Matt Kincaid had with the two pretty women who tried to kill them aboard a northbound train. When he finished, Tanner's eyes bulged. "You mean the blonde was toting a sawed-off shotgun under her petticoat?" Burns frowned. "Yep, and the brunette a derringer. If it hadn't been for the quick gun hand of Sheriff Kincaid, I would have died from their beauty. They had me a little distracted." Jubal's telling of his experience got Burns' attention. He looked over his shoulder at the pretty redhead who was wearing a long dress and a wide smile. From her lap, she waved her hand at him shyly, but instead of reciprocating in like fashion, he bit his bottom lip and quickly turned back around. "Dang women. Get a fellow killed if you ain't careful." Jubal and his deputies arrived in Mansfield with no incident and delivered Ed Wheeler to the sheriff, who was waiting outside on the stoop. "Marshal Stone, so you got our horse thief back to us. I'm Ben Phelps." The sheriff thumped out the remains of his smoke into the street and turned to Wheeler. "Ed, what in Sam Hill have you done with my chestnut?" Jubal looked off grinning, as did Tanner and Jericho. Then he turned back to Phelps. "Sheriff, we're going to hunt up some chow before the whistle blows for Fort Worth." Burns uncuffed the prisoner and himself, returning his cuffs to his back pocket. Ben waved and pushed open the door. With pistol in hand, he barked, "Let's go, Ed. You'll face a judge in the morning." As Wheeler stepped forward, Phelps kicked him in the rear and slammed the door. The three Waco lawmen chuckled as they moved down the boardwalk. In a few minutes, they found a local eatery and enjoyed a good supper. As they sat down, Jubal quickly glanced around the diner, a habitual practice of his. The place was full of people and chatter. In the very back corner sat two men who looked familiar, two men he'd seen on wanted posters. Jericho picked up on Jubal's concern, as did Tanner. "Marshal, something troubling you about them fellers back yonder?" Tatum gestured with his head. Jubal hung his hat on the corner of the chair and sat down. His deputies did the same. Then he turned his cup right side up and took the cloth beside his plate and laid it across his lap. "Just relax, fellers, but let me know if those in the back corner come our way." "Who are they, Jubal?" asked Burns with excitement in his eyes. "They wanted?" "Yep. Bigger of the two is Rufus Tidwell. He's a bank robber wanted in Laredo for killing a constable. Saw his ugly face on a poster last week. The other one is a feller named Juan Lupe, better known as Little Pecos." "Little Pecos," said Tanner. "Why, he's killed over 10 men. Burns leaned forward and took hold of the table with both hands. "I was reading about him in the Waco Chronicle 2 days ago. He's being hunted across the frontier, and yonder he sits, here in Mansfield." Tanner leaned back in his chair and stared toward the outlaws. Though he didn't mean to, Burns tipped off the highbinders with his eyes. Rufus was the first to react. He began walking their way. "The big one's stopping toward us with a pretty good grouch on," said Jericho. The waitress now was standing at their table. "What can I get for you, gents?" "Go get the sheriff, Jericho. Tell him to meet me out on the street." Jubal looked up the tall, dirty blonde, pretentiously. "Ma'am, we've had a change of mind. Got to tend to our horses. Make 'em back directly." She frowned and quickly moved to the next table without a word. The deputies stood up and pushed their chairs back under the table. Jubal reached for his hat, but at the same time pulled his gun and eased it just inside his coat. "Hold up there, young feller," yelled Rufus as he pointed directly at Tanner. "Why were you gloating at me, Tin Horn?" Tanner stopped and turned for a moment and made eye contact with the big man. Then he looked at Jubal, who gestured for him to get outside. Burns was torn between Jubal's command and defending his honor. However, a stern thumb from Stone sent him exiting the restaurant swiftly. Rufus walked past Jubal and shouted, "Stop, you!" Suddenly, the huge man stopped in his tracks as he felt the cold iron against the back of his neck. "Shut your pie trap, Tidwell, and keep walking slowly. I'm Marshal Jubal Stone and you're under arrest." Jubal reached around to the killer's holster and relieved him of his gun so smoothly that Tidwell's partner did not see what took place. Poking him in the back with his gun, he whispered, "Move toward that door, Rufus, and one wrong move from you and you'll be as dead as that constable you killed back in Laredo."
What's going on up here, Tidwell? Came a voice from behind them in a Mexican accent. What for you not answering me, big man? It's a law dog, Juan, yelled Tidwell. Kill him. He turned just in time to catch the tip of Jubal's pistol barrel between his eyes. He collapsed to the floor like a dead man. As Stone turned to face the Mexican, the killer grabbed the woman nearby by the hair and pulled her up from her chair. Standing behind her, he held his gun to her head. Jubal kept his pistol waist high, debating whether or not to take a chance on killing Pecos without hitting the woman. He decided against it and relaxed his stance. Lupe now saw Stone's badge. I'll kill her for sure, Marshal, if you don't get out of the way of that door. All right, little Pecos, you ain't leaving Mansfield with that woman. Jubal knew the best he could do was goad the Mexican into a gunfight, knowing most of them were egotistical maniacs anyway. Heard you killed near a dozen men. Is that how you did it, behind a skirt? What's your name, lawman? Juan asked through his scowl. Maybe one day little Pecos would come visit your grave. He spat on the floor and chuckled. I'm Jubal Stone, a United States Marshal, and you're under arrest. Lupe grinned sadistically as he pushed the terrified woman forward toward the door. He gasped for air, trying not to faint. Jubal backed toward the door with his pistol in hand. That's all right, lawman, outside. Juan shook his pistol. Wasn't planning on killing me, Marshal, but why not? You lawmen are all the same to me. You ain't done it yet, Lupe, said Jubal as he took his last step before being on the stoop. When he went backwards through the door, he glanced behind him and saw his deputies and the sheriff with drawn guns. Little Pecos pushed the woman forcefully out onto the stoop. Then he saw 4 heavily armed lawmen. Drop your gun, Lupe, and I will let you live, yelled the sheriff. Jubal waved a hand behind his back to discourage the sheriff's aggressiveness. Juan smiled. Sheriff, word on the street of Mansfield is that you lost your horse. And you figured you can kill little Pecos, no? Me not think so. But this fight is between me and the Marshal. He pointed his pistol at himself, then to Jubal. But no worries, Sheriff. I will save a bullet for you. Now you 3 clear the street or this señorita will die. Stone glanced over his shoulder and waved his men and the sheriff off the street. All right, Pecos, let her go. As you said, this is between me and you. Pecos leaned forward and sniffed the woman's hair, then kissed her neck. But if we just had more time together. But maybe next time. He threw her to the wooden boardwalk and climbed down the steps, slowly moving toward Stone. His confidence found expression through a 3x9 grin. So you want to die, Marshal? I will gladly oblige you. Jubal took 3 steps in his direction and stopped. Shuck that hog leg, Pecos, and throw up your hands. Lupe stuck his thumbs into his belt and rocked back and forth on his heels, laughing boisterously. No one takes a gun of Lil Pecos, and I'll never surrender to the law. Never. I go where I want to go because I want to go, amigo. I know where you're going in less than a minute, and from what I hear the preacher say, it's not where you want to go. But if you're fool enough to reach for that pistol, adios, amigo. Both men went for their guns at the same time, but Stone's quick shot from the hip proved deadly for Pecos. The lead from the Marshal's .44 spun the small Mexican around in a full circle as he fired his pistol in the air twice, then a 3rd time, then a 4th before buckling to his knees. Rufus came staggering out of the door with his pistol raised. Jubal's eyes and Colt locked onto him quickly, as did Jericho, who raised his Winchester and peeled off the wood from around the doorframe. Drop your iron, Tidwell. You're under arrest, demanded Stone. Surprisingly, the big man did as he was told. Apparently, Jericho's warning shot brought him to full consciousness. Rufus slowly climbed down the saloon steps and walked over to Pecos' body. Rubbing his chin, he said, Didn't think nobody could take a Mexican. He stood there staring down at his partner. Good friend of yours, was he? Said the Marshal, really not caring one way or the other. Tidwell looked toward Jubal. Just benefited from his fast gun the last few months, that's all. It's all over now. Marshal, I want to shake your hand. The best Pecos took some doing. He started moving towards Jubal. Tanner, along with the sheriff, were surprised at Stone's lack of reaction. Why's you letting Tidwell walk toward him like that? Asked Sheriff Phelps.
Jericho grinned and spoke out of the side of his mouth.
Just watch and you'll see.
Stone hadn't brought what Rufus was selling, not by a long chalk. He shoved his pistol back into leather and watched intently as a badge killer moved toward him with an outstretched hand. Just as Rufus got within swinging distance, he slung a fist at Jubal. Stone ducked and caught Tidwell with an uppercut to the chin with the barrel of his Colt. Rufus crashed to the ground like a huge felled cottonwood.
Told you, Sheriff. Marshal Stone knows what he's doing.
Jericho smiled as he, Burns, and Phelps went toward Jubal to join him in the street.
Dang, Stone, said Mansfield's only lawman. You took a powerful chance with them two. I didn't even know these fellas were in town.
Jericho spoke up.
Hope I handled that right, Marshal.
You did just fine, boys. He looked over at Tanner. What did you learn from this, Deputy Burns? Tanner lowered his head and kicked the dirt.
That a stare can be deadly.
You're right. Whether it's looking at a pretty woman or a highbinder like those two sleeping beauties. Jubal stared down at Tidwell and Pecos. Stay in control. He put his hand to Tanner's shoulder. Understand?
Yes, sir, I do.
Sheriff, said Marshal Stone, we'll help you get the big one in a cell, then we gotta get a wiggle on.
Obliged, Marshal.
Phelps rubbed the back of his neck nervously as he leaned into Jubal.
You know, I ain't so sure what I'd done if I had known these two were in Mansfield. Figured to beat Pecos in a draw would have been above my band, but I reckon I'd give him it my best shot,
the old lawman said. Jubal smiled with sincerity. The fact that the old fellow was still wearing a badge was appreciated. Glad we were here, Sheriff. There's one thing I can't abide, it's a man who will kill lawmen, and them two here are two pigs in a pan when it comes to being badge killers. Fellers, let's get Rufus down to the jail. He looked over to Pecos. I reckon he's beyond helping. When they finished dragging Tidwell down the street and into a cell, they hustled over to the diner to resume eating the meal they never got to eat. The same waitress came to their table, but this time she was a mite friendlier. Your meals are on the house, gents. Mrs. Stedman, the owner over yonder, pointed with her pen, said you fellas did Mansfield a favor by, in his words, taking out the trash. She spoke those last 4 words out of the side of her mouth. Jubal looked across the room and nodded at Stedman, the man raising a hand. Thank you, ma'am. Me and my deputies are obliged, aren't we, boys? Jericho said a hearty, yes, we are. But Tanner just sat and smiled at the waitress. Jubal and Jericho glanced at each other, grinned, and shook their heads, wondering if he'd ever learn to keep his eyes to himself. When the dirty blonde walked away toward the kitchen with their orders, Jericho kicked Tanner in the leg from underneath the table. You remember that last airbow got us killed. Marshal, we best stop by the livery and get him a pair of blinders. The 3 lawmen chuckled as they each grabbed the hot roll from the basket the waitress had put in front of them. The men finished their steaks and potatoes and spooned down their dessert, blackberry cobbler with 2 scoops of ice cream on top. Then off in the distance they heard the train whistle blow once, then twice. Jericho, you and Tanner fetch our horses at the livery. Jubal grabbed his hat from the chair. I'm going to drop by the telegraph office and check in with the judge. Stone arrives at the telegraph office and quickly gave the man behind the desk his name. The tall, slender fellow with a thin mustache and receding hairline promptly thumbed through a short stack of messages. Here it is, Marshal, from Judge Leon Brewster. Obliged. He took it in hand and read it as he walked out the door. Marshal Stone, 4 Rangers and 2 Marshals awaiting you in Amarillo. They'll help escort Fletcher as far as Fort Worth. Hope to have another lawman to help get you, your deputies, and our prisoner to Waco. Watch your back trail and get back safely. Signed, Judge Leon Brewster. Jubal got to the train just as his deputies were closing the door on the stock car. How's my roan doing? A liveryman said the 3 of them made a bait of hay and each had 2 quarts of oats. Tanner smiled and pushed up on the brim of his hat. But Red didn't kind to load him back up in that car so soon. Tied him in the corner and left him stomping the steel floor. Chapter 10. The men made Fort Worth that evening where they shared a meal with Sheriff Harold Rigby. Been expecting you, Jubal. Reckon you've heard that extraditing Fletcher to Waco's done cost 2 lawmen their lives. Before Stone could respond, Rigby tapped the table. I remember you telling me and Ketchum that was bound to happen. There's been 2 more wounded at Amarillo. Blamed bounty hunters rushed the jail and tried to take him. One of them was a 15-year-old ridge runner from El Paso. Man with his grandpappy, both armed with scatter guns, and birdshot the way I hear it. Dang, we can't get to Amarillo soon enough. What happened to the boy and his grandpa? The deputy shot and killed the old man. Boy, well, I figure he's in the cell next to Fletcher right now. The love of money, Jubal said as he looked across the table at his deputies, his eyes darting from one of them to the other. You plan to bring Fletcher back this way, Jubal? Asked Rigby. Ain't sure yet, Harold. Might. Would that meet with your approval? I brought 2 good lawmen with me. Jubal stared over to Tanner and Jericho. We'll guard him until the next train out, if we come back this way. Hoping Judge Brewster's efforts will have us some more iron backing us by then. Rigby lifted his hat and rubbed his head aggressively. I'd like to put my eyes on Fletcher myself. Better yet, hands. That devil not only killed your family, but the blood of hundreds across the frontier are on his hands. Burns and Tatum stared intently at one another, then to Jubal. Sheriff Rigby saw the exchange. Turning to Jubal and pointing to them, he said, You mean they don't know? Jubal shook his head and took another sip of his coffee. Go on and tell him, Harold. Right. 10 years back, Tobias Fletcher and 3 other highbinders rode onto the Stones' homestead and gunned down Jubal's pa, ma, and sister. Joe Stone was a sheriff of Abilene and had sent the men to jail on bank robbery and killing a teller. Them sorry dogs returned to pay him back. Jubal sighed. All true, fellers. All true. Marshal, said Jericho. I reckon if anybody had a right to gun Fletcher, it would be you. Me and Tanner ain't going to stand in your way, are we? Bird shook his head emphatically. The fact is, we'll help you string him up if you have a mind to. Jubal appreciated his deputy's loyalty and their sympathy, but the lawman side of him didn't like what he was hearing. I had a man tell me recently that he watched 5 fellers hang from a wagon train massacre. 2 of the people that died at their hands was his wife and baby boy. Said it made him feel hollow and didn't bring back his family. Surprised by Jubal's words, Rigby leaned in. Jubal, you're telling me that you're willing to risk your life and the lives of your deputies to protect Tobias Fletcher? Reckon that question, Harold, will be answered soon enough. If the 4 of us show up in Waco all alive. Jubal pushed away from the table. We best get some sleep, fellers. Jump with that iron horse at daybreak. We've got a long day ahead of us tomorrow, over 300 miles by rail. Chapter 11. Stone and his deputies reached Amarillo just after midnight the next day. As they climbed off the train, they began immediately seeing men wearing badges and toting guns. That brought a smile to Jubal's face, and solace to his deputies, who were on edge. They led their horses up Main Street to the jail and tied them to the hitch. A Texas Ranger carrying a Winchester in the bend of his arm welcomed him. Marshal Stone, I'm Ranger Justin Willard. Expecting you and your boys. Town's been quiet since them 2 tried to take Fletcher a few days ago at gunpoint. Of course, that was before we arrived. He spat his quid and wiped his mouth with his sleeve. Stone extended his hand. Obliged for you coming, Ranger Willard. These here are my deputies, Tanner Burns and Jericho Tatum. He bent a thumb their way. Glad to know you fellas. There's another ranger at the end of town and one on the roof above us. He gestured toward the roof. You men get some rest. We'll watch the back door tonight. Hotel's up yonder. It ain't much, but figure it'll be better than a train seat. Tanner, take our horses to the livery. Jericho and I are going to check on the prisoner. Yes, sir. He led the 3 horses away. Jubal stared at the door as if looking at a coiled rattlesnake. I've been waiting for this day for 9 long years, to look the man who killed my folks eye to eye and face to face. He's on the other side of that door. Jubal's heart began to race and his fists balled into knots. Let's go, Jericho. Both men moved forward. Ranger Willard stood to his feet and tapped on the door with the butt of his gun. Marshal Jubal Stone is here and his deputy. He stepped aside and waved Stone and Tatum forward. Glad to see you, Marshal, said the sheriff of Amarillo, Tyler Kenzie, as he wagged his head from side to side. This is my deputy, Kyle Jones. Throwing a thumb over his shoulder toward the cells behind the interior door, he continued. You can't get Fletcher out of here fast enough to suit me. Got me 2 wounded deputies on this account. Before that, 2 more lawmen were killed when they crossed the Colorado line into Texas with that cur. Blame bounty hunters. Got one in there, just a kid. Dang fool. Jubal reached down and untied the leg thong on his holster and unbuckled his gun, then handed it to Jericho. The room fell silent. Then he drew his knife out of the scabbard and flipped it in the air and handed a handle first to his deputy. "I'm going in to see Fletcher." Sheriff Kinsey gestured to his deputy to open the interior door. As Stone moved forward, he spun on his heels. "Hold on to this for me, Jericho." He flipped his badge in the air to his deputy, then stepped inside. "Well, if it is Marshal Jubal Stone of Waco," came a deep voice from his bunk in a dark corner. "I figured we'd meet again." Jubal looked toward the deputy and Fletcher's locked cell. "Open it and clear out. Take that boy yonder with you and shut the door behind you." It was the young man who tried, with the help of his grandpa, to take Tobias. The deputy poked his head out into the office. "Sheriff Kinsey, the marshal's requesting I take the boy and leave him alone with Fletcher." Jericho stepped forward. "Fletcher killed Marshal Stone's family. I fear he has a right." Kinsey looked to the ranger standing by the door, then to Jericho, and back to his deputy. "Do as he says, Kyle. Fetch the boy, shut the door, and let's grab a cup of coffee, and I'll step out on the stoop for some air." Jones did as the sheriff told him. He unlocked the boy's cell and pointed him toward the door. Then he handed Jubal the keys and whispered as he walked by him, "I heard what he did to your folks." Jubal took the keys, handed the deputy his hat on the way out, and stared angrily at Tobias through the bars as Jones closed the door. "Well, what are you waiting for, Stone? An invitation? Come on in here, Scar." Fletcher chuckled loudly. Stone slowly moved toward the locked door and inserted the key. When he stepped inside, Fletcher yelled, "Come on in, Jubal Stone. I got something for you." In that moment, Jubal was transported back in time, as a 14-year-old standing in the corn crib, looking through the knotholes as he heard one of the riders call out to his father, "Come on out, Sheriff Stone. I got something for you." The man who yelled these words was the same man standing a few feet from him in the cell. Stone was paralyzed in the moment. Fletcher, although in his late 50s, looked haggard, moved with amazing agility across a 6x8 cell, hammer and tongs. He punched Jubal in the stomach, then hit him with an uppercut to the chin. Stone's head slammed into the cell wall. Suddenly, Jubal came to life. He caught Tobias's fist in the air and pushed him backwards. Then the anger of 9 years was unleashed on the man who killed his family. For the next 5 minutes, Jubal Stone beat Tobias Fletcher to a pulp, relentlessly hitting him with hammer fists to the face until he was barely conscious. Yet to Jubal's surprise, Fletcher continued to taunt him. Lying on the floor, looking up through a bloody nose and a quickly swelling eye, Tobias, out of breath, tried twice to speak, but couldn't. Jubal had him by the shirt with his fist raised in the air. In one last try, Fletcher spoke through a busted lip and in a broken voice. "Scar." Jubal raised his fist higher and was willing to offer what he hoped would be a death blow to Tobias. But then the words of Judge Brewster began echoing in his mind. He realized that in that moment to continue brutalizing Fletcher would do nothing but put him on a level with this devil. So he released Tobias's shirt and lowered his fist. As he rose from straddling Fletcher's body, he pulled his archenemy up from the floor and helped him to his bunk. Then he stepped through the door and locked it behind him. Jubal walked out on the stoop where the other lawmen were, wiping his bloody knuckles with his handkerchief, not proud of what he'd just done. "You got a doctor in this town?" "You need one, Marshal?" asked Sheriff Kinsey. "No, but Tobias does. Get him one, please." The men stared back and forth at one another. Then the sheriff gestured to his deputy. "Cal, fetch the doc." "On it, Sheriff." He jumped out of his chair and set his cup down on the floor. Jubal took his seat but didn't say a word for the next few minutes. He just kept wiping the blood from his knuckles and staring across the street. Jericho glanced his way several times. Off in the distance, he heard a familiar voice. It was Tanner coming from the livery. "What'd I miss?" He looked over to Jubal and saw the bloody cloth in his hands. "What'd I miss?" No one answered, so he headed inside to take a look for himself. Ranger Willard cleared his throat. Marshal, if you and your boys want to head up the street and get some sleep, I'll tell the other rangers to be ready to pull out of Fort Worth tomorrow. Obliged, Justin. Tanner came out of the door smiling. I don't think he'll be in any shape to give us trouble on the way home. He's lying on his bed of pain just a moaning. Bully for you, Jubal. Jericho raised a hand at Tanner, trying to discourage his enthusiasm, knowing Jubal, as it looked, seemed to be regretting his actions. Stone sighed, then stood to his feet. Sheriff, let me know the cost of Doctor and Fletcher. I'll settle up with you in the morning. I'm going to get some shut-eye. He flipped Jericho 2 gold eagles. You boys enjoy Amarillo, but behave yourselves. I hear this town has a rank sheriff. Stone winked at Kenzie and bid everyone a good night. Then he pulled down his hat and walked up the boardwalk toward the hotel. Now, fellers, said Ranger Willard, there goes one heck of a lawman, the same cut of his paw, Joe Stone. Everyone raised his cup of coffee. Hear, hear to Marshal Jubal Stone. Over the next couple of days, Jubal and his posse of lawmen, along with his prisoner, Tobias Fletcher, traveled the rails back to Waco without incident. 3 weeks later, a jury found Tobias Fletcher, a.k.a. Albert Dillingham, guilty of cattle rustling and multiple murders across the frontier, including the deaths of multiple lawmen. After the hanging, Judge Brewster stepped away from the gallows and over to Marshal Stone. He placed his hand on Jubal's shoulder. It's finally over, son. Now you can put this behind you. Jubal nodded and his eyes watered. You were right, Judge. I feel as hollow as a dead log, and I'd like to go and visit my folks in Abilene. Been gone a couple of weeks, if that meets with your approval. Permission granted, Marshal. I figured you earned some loafing time. Tell your pa I said hello. A few days later, Jubal sat his saddle at the entrance of Cherry Hill Cemetery, playing his flute. He had some catching up to do with his family before his next assignment as the United States Marshal. This concludes Jubal Stone, U.S. Marshal, Eye for an Eye, by Casey Nash. Copyright by Casey Nash, published by Dusty Saddle Publishing, a division of DS Productions.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Stagecoach, brought to you by Dusty Saddles Publishing, the home of Western excellence, where the best of the Western authors can be found. Visit our website at dspublishingnetwork.com.